What you're watching right now is not just another Middle East scare, it's a stress test of power, a stress test of assumptions, and a stress test of whether Washington truly understands the kind of opponent it has spent decades trying to contain. Because the real question is not whether the United States can strike Iran. Of course it can. The real question is what happens after the strike. After the first wave, after the headlines, after the confident briefings and the televised certainty. What happens when a campaign leaves the clean world of planning documents and enters the dirty world of cost, time, retaliation, and uncertainty? That is where strategic mistakes begin. For years, Iran was often discussed as if it were a target profile, a sanctioned economy, an isolated regime, a weaker conventional military, a state under pressure that could be managed through deterrence, sanctions, and occasional force. But that framing was incomplete from the beginning. Iran was never just a weak state under pressure. Iran became a pressure-adapted system. And that distinction matters, because powerful states make the same mistake over and over again. They confuse the ability to apply pressure with the ability to control outcomes. Those are not the same thing. A country can dominate global finance, command advanced military platforms, build powerful alliances, and still misread the adversary in front of it. And when that happens, the costs of miscalculation compound fast. This is the deeper story behind the headlines. When people ask, can the U.S. hit Iran? They are asking the easiest question in the entire chain. The harder question, the one that actually determines history, is this. Which side can absorb the next 3 moves without losing coherence? Because strategy is not just about striking power. It is about sustainable power. It is about whether your military options remain politically, economically, and logistically usable after the first dramatic move. And that is where the conversation usually becomes dangerously shallow. Major powers do not make decisions in a vacuum. They make decisions under constraints, stockpiles, readiness cycles, industrial replacement rates, alliance coordination, domestic politics, debt burdens, election calendars, and competing theaters. So when officials and commentators talk about options, the better question is, which options are sustainable and for how long? That is where strategy becomes real. And once you look at the situation that way, the picture changes. This is not about claiming that the United States is weak. It is not. It is about recognizing that even very powerful states operate under constraints, and that constraints become visible during prolonged escalation. That is the shift many people miss. The revelation is not that Iran is invincible. It is not. The revelation is that Iran was never the simplified target many people wanted it to be. Iran's power is not just measured in GDP, not just in aircraft counts, not just in conventional military comparisons. Iran's power is built around cost imposition, missiles, drones, proxy elasticity, geographic leverage, strategic ambiguity, political tolerance for pain, the ability to absorb punishment and still make escalation expensive. That is real power in a constrained conflict environment. And history keeps punishing states that fail to understand that kind of power. Look at the recurring pattern. A dominant power builds a pressure architecture. It believes it controls the visible levers, finance, alliances, technology, legitimacy, escalation timing, military superiority. Pressure expands. The target adapts. Adaptation reveals hidden constraints. Then the stronger side is forced into recognition. That pattern is older than America. Napoleon ran into it. Britain ran into it in the colonies. The United States ran into it in Vietnam. Different eras, different systems. Same structural mistake. Take Napoleon and the continental system. On paper, it looked like strategic genius. Control Europe's ports, cut Britain off from trade, squeeze the rival economically. Visible dominance, administrative control, system confidence. But enforcing that pressure required constant intervention across a huge and unwilling landscape. Smuggling expanded, local elites resisted, enforcement costs rose. The strategy became more compulsive the more it struggled. Then came the misreading. Napoleon interpreted systemic strain as disobedience that could be solved with more force. But command over visible territory did not equal command over hidden adaptation. That was the trap. Now look at Britain and the American colonies. Britain had naval supremacy, legal authority, imperial reach, and overwhelming military superiority. From London, tighter administration and revenue extraction looked rational. But what the imperial center saw as a compliance problem was becoming a legitimacy crisis. Taxes, enforcement, and centralization did not simply restore control. They organized resistance, boycotts, local assemblies, print networks, militias, coordination. Britain still had superior force, but superior force did not automatically translate into effective control across distance, fractured loyalties, and political transformation. Again, the stronger side has measured power in institutions and formal authority. The weaker side generated power through adaptation, distribution, and endurance. And then there is Vietnam, one of the clearest examples of a modern strategic mismeasurement. The United States entered with industrial capacity, air power, alliance prestige, and immense technological superiority. The war became saturated with metrics. Bombs dropped, sorties flown, body counts, territory contested. It looked measurable, manageable, escalatable. But the opponent was fighting a different kind of war. Political, decentralized, patient, adaptive. As the U.S. increased pressure, the machinery of escalation became self-reinforcing. More troops, more bombing, more resources, more proof of resolve. Yet tactical power did not produce strategic control. Why? Because the measurements being used did not capture the real center of gravity. The stronger side had the larger arsenal, but the weaker theory of victory. That is the recurring lesson. And that is exactly why Iran matters now. For decades, much of U.S. policy toward Iran operated on an assumption stack. Iran is under sanctions, therefore it is weakening in a strategically linear way. Iran's economy is constrained, therefore its regional influence will decline proportionally. Iran lacks U.S. style conventional dominance, therefore pressure plus deterrence plus selective force should be enough to shape outcomes. Iran's proxies can be hit in pieces without producing wider, uncontrollable consequences. Iran's nuclear program can be pressured within a framework Washington ultimately manages. Those assumptions helped build a formidable pressure architecture. Sanctions, dollar leverage, export control, surveillance, intelligence operations, forward basing, naval presence, missile defense cooperation, and repeated coercive signaling. On paper, the imbalance looked overwhelming, and that is exactly why the danger was never the setup. The danger was always what happened after the setup. Because pressure did not remain temporary leverage, it became a permanent environment. Sanctions became structural. Proxy conflicts multiplied. Each flare-up generated demands for more pressure. Each Iranian move justified another layer of containment. And while many observers expected linear exhaustion, Iran adapted. It hardened facilities, expanded missile and drone capabilities, built redundancies, deepened regional relationships with different levels of deniability, improved survivability, turned life under pressure into doctrine. This is where analysis often fails, because adaptation does not always look dramatic in real time. Headlines reward spectacle, a strike, a speech, a warning, a breakthrough, a collapse. But in long strategic contests, survivability is the breakthrough. Survivability is power. That is the point, and that brings us to the most dangerous phase, the crisis of interpretation. This is the phase where the stronger side sees disruption and mistakes it for strategic success. Damage is counted, targets are hit, narratives are declared, confidence rises, but the target is not collapsing, it is adapting. And as it adapts, the cost of maintaining the old narrative rises. That is when rhetoric and reality begin to separate. Public language remains maximal. Strength, deterrence, dominance, resolve. Private planning becomes cautious. Inventories, retaliation windows, regional spillover, alliance exposure, escalation control, uncertain end states. That gap between public certainty and private caution is where miscalculation lives. And that gap is the real story. Because the danger is not only what leaders say, it is what their systems can sustain. Iran's power in this environment is not based on platform symmetry. It does not need to match the United States ship for ship or aircraft for aircraft. Its power is the ability to create cost curves. That is the phrase to remember, cost curves. In a crisis, the battlefield does not stay local. It spreads into layers. Bases, shipping lanes, partner territory, energy infrastructure, insurance pricing, cyber risk, political messaging, alliance cohesion, domestic market anxiety. That is not symbolic leverage. That is strategic leverage. And then there's the nuclear layer, whether framed as latency, breakout risk, bargaining leverage, or strategic ambiguity. Whatever label you choose, it increases the cost of miscalculation. Because infrastructure can be hit, but knowledge does not vanish. Facilities can be damaged, but capability pathways are not automatically erased. Personnel, technical expertise, and reconstitution potential remain part of the equation. A strike can degrade. It does not necessarily resolve. That distinction matters. Now at the part powerful states rarely like to say clearly in public. They have fragilities too. The United States remains extraordinarily capable, but capability does not erase inventory math. It does not erase industrial bottlenecks. It does not erase geography. It does not erase alliance dependence. It does not erase replacement timelines. It does not erase simultaneous commitments in multiple theaters. This is how strategic revelation works. A dominant power does not suddenly become weak. It discovers that its escalation bandwidth is finite, and the adversary it discounted was built to exploit finite bandwidth. Once you see that, the pattern becomes hard to unsee. A pressure architecture is built and treated as strategic command. That architecture expands into permanence. Sanctions, proxy confrontation, signaling cycles, repeated commitments, rising costs. The target does not collapse linearly. It adapts into layered deterrence. Then major escalation starts carrying wider risks, longer timelines, higher expenditures, alliance friction, and uncertain end states. And as elite language shifts from confidence to caution, the system quietly admits the original measurement problem. Iran's power was not invisible. It was measured with the wrong ruler. And this is where most commentary goes shallow, because people hear the word power and default to the most visible categories. Money, platforms, alliances, advanced technology, those matter. But in constrained escalation environments, especially around choke points, proxies, and strategic signaling, other dimensions can matter just as much, and sometimes more. Endurance, recoverability, escalation flexibility, deterrent credibility, geographic leverage, political tolerance for pain. By those metrics, Iran looks far more formidable than the simplified version often presented in public debate. Endurance means surviving sustained pressure without losing strategic coherence. Decades of sanctions, sabotage, threats, and isolation do not just weaken a state. They can also build institutional memory, covert channels, rationing habits, narrative discipline, and patience. Recoverability means what happens after impact. Can command structures persist after losses? Can infrastructure be rebuilt? Can networks regenerate? Real strength is often revealed after disruption, not before it. Escalation flexibility means the ability to respond directly, indirectly, deniably, symbolically, or with delay. That complicates an opponent's planning and widens uncertainty around timing, location, and scale. Deterrent credibility is not about matching hardware one for one. It is about making the expected cost of action hard to bound. Geographic leverage is not background scenery. It is part of the deterrent system: shipping routes, regional infrastructure, partner vulnerabilities, logistics corridors. And political tolerance for pain matters because different political systems absorb and narrate pain differently. Democracies are not weak. Authoritarian systems are not automatically stronger. But they process short-term costs differently, and that can distort estimates of who reaches a breaking point first. This is the strategic reality that gets buried under headline theater. And headline theater is exactly what keeps people late to reality. So if you want to understand what comes next, stop watching this story like a spectator waiting for the next explosion. Watch it like an engineer studying a machine. Ask what inputs keep producing the same outputs. Ask which assumptions are being protected at all costs. Ask why the public script sounds simpler than the private planning. Watch constraints, not performances. Watch inventories. Watch replacement timelines. Watch alliance access. Watch shipping risk. Watch energy sensitivity. Watch domestic calendars. Watch how many fronts each side is effectively managing at once. Because a strike, a warning, a sanctions package, a dramatic statement, none of these by themselves tells you who is stronger in strategic terms. The real test is coherence under iteration. Who can take the next move and the next without losing the ability to function strategically? If a dominant power is escalating pressure while publicly insisting the target is weak and the target keeps adapting instead of collapsing, then the system is already in the dangerous stage. And if private planning sounds increasingly cautious, while public rhetoric remains maximal, that gap is not a side note. That gap is the story. Because the most dangerous phase is not always the first strike. It is the period when leaders cannot easily admit the limits of their own machine. That is when signaling gets distorted. That is when narratives get louder. That is when actors are tempted to do something dramatic to preserve credibility. And that is when systems make their worst mistakes. So no, this is not just another headline cycle. This is a moment of forced recognition. Not necessarily total war, not necessarily immediate de-escalation, not necessarily a single decisive event. It may become diplomacy. It may become limited confrontation. It may become proxy escalation. It may become a broader regional crisis. No one can honestly guarantee the sequence. But the mechanism is already visible. When overconfidence builds a pressure machine, that machine generates the very adaptation it was supposed to prevent. Then adaptation exposes the limits the stronger side tried not to discuss. And eventually, those limits force recognition, whether leaders admit it cleanly or not. That is the strategic story unfolding. Not a sudden surprise, not a freak intelligence failure, not one bad meeting. A repeatable historical pattern colliding with a state that has spent decades preparing to survive this exact kind of pressure. So if you want to understand the next stage, do not ask only whether conflict expands. Ask whether the cost of maintaining the illusion has become higher than the cost of admitting the truth. Because that is the decision point every pressure empire eventually reaches. And when it reaches it, the danger comes not only from rhetoric, but from systems that can no longer sustain the story they were built to tell. That is what you're watching now. Not just a Middle East scare, a stress test of power, of assumptions, of strategic reality. And in stress tests, the most important result is never what the machine says at the start. It's what the machine can still carry when the load keeps rising.